Okay, so we're going to go over what we discovered in class. Control H to hide the texture box. As you know, we have 3 vases in this scene. They will all render with a ramp shader on them. You are encouraged to adjust that shader to something you want, even if it's just a solid color. I just have this in here so you can kind of see what it looks like. And it already has some basic render attributes that render decently, so your render should be decent to begin with. Okay, so we're just going to start with this one. I'm getting it up here somewhere like this, and I'm getting it at 5 so it doesn't have to worry about shaders. I'm going to crack this first. So under Effects, I'm going to go to Shatter. I'm going to use the solid shatter. Let's do 8 for this. So the requirements for the assignment was 1 has to shatter into at least 8 pieces. I think it was. It may have been 5. If you did yours at 5 already, that's fine. But I believe 8's better. 1 only has to break into 2 pieces, and then the other one doesn't have to break at all, but they all have to have some sort of dynamic simulation of a fall on them. So we're going to shatter this into 8 pieces. I'm going to go ahead and set my jagginess up a little bit, set my seed value up a little bit, link to shards, rigid bodies with collision off, and those are the settings you need to have. And when I hit create, it's going to simulate my vase here, and if I hit play, nothing happens. So one of the things we can do is if we go to I always try to keep my outliner up, okay, so we can just see what's going on, and so we can quickly select stuff. So one of the reasons nothing is happening, well, there's 2 reasons nothing is happening. One is we have the vase selected. We have the pieces of the vase selected, the shards, as opposed to the top level vase. So if we go into the channel box and select Vase02 mesh and turn shatter off, by hitting 0 is off, 1 is on, or you can type OFF or ON. Now if we hit play, nothing's happening. What we need to do is we're going to apply a gravity to this object. Now it's already got a rigid body on there, but there's no field affecting it, so that's why nothing's happening. So we'll just set field gravity, and if I hit play, it falls now. And this is the solid object, this isn't the shatter pieces underneath. So we will actually reattach those to the gravity here in a bit. So now we hit, we want this to bounce off this object, so we're going to create passive rigid body on this object, and now when we hit play, that's not bad. And the reason this is working is because it actually already possibly is working, is because I'd actually changed this earlier, but if you're playing this and not getting, well, it's actually working with it anyway. If you're playing with it and the vase is not bouncing or it's sticking in the floor, which this one kind of does toward the end there, it's actually this under rigid solver, it's the collision tolerance. So like 0.001 maybe will give you a little bit of a better reaction. So that's kind of what we're going on at with that. So now what we're going to do is we need to simulate, or we need for this vase to shatter at the point that it hits the ground. We can also put a little bit of forward momentum on it if we want. So we'll say like initial settings, we can put a little bit of -z. So we'll say -3 and the initial velocity. So now when I hit play, it's doing that, and that's what we wanted to do. Back. Yeah, that's feeling pretty good. Okay, so back at 0. What I'm going to do is I'm going to frame by frame it just by clicking on the next frame, until I see the frame that it hits the ground. Now if you skip any frames, it's going to mess it up. So you can also hit play and then pause right at the point that it stops. It looks like it's hitting right at about 10. So like I'm going to turn my shatter on in between 10 and 11. Okay, so I'm going to go back to frame 10, right click on shatter, key selected, go to 11, hit 1 to turn it on, right click on shatter, key selected. What we're going to get is it goes to the floor. Now the reason it goes to the floor is right before it hits. So maybe these frames are actually wrong. So we're going to shift these shatter frames later. To do that, I'm just going to click in the timeline, hold down Shift and middle mouse drag to highlight those, and I'm just going to drag them one frame down. So what we should get now is it should hit the ground, bounce up, and then go flying off into pieces. So it was one frame early. So what we need now is we want gravity to start affecting those pieces after the shatter turns on, because what is happening is it's basically hiding the full object on frame 11 or on frame 12. The full object is going transparent, and the pieces are becoming visible. So what we want is for those pieces to be affected by gravity as well. And in our outliner, we can just select all of these shards, go to Windows, Settings, Relationship Editor, Dynamic Relationships, and since I already had them all selected, I can just now click Gravity to apply gravity to each of those fields. Okay, so now what's going to happen is they get gravity and then they go through the floor, which is also not really what we wanted. Turn off this grid. The grid's annoying. Okay, so let's go back to 0 and oh, what did I just do? Okay, so what we want now is for these objects to be affected by the ground plane. Problem with that is the reason they're not is because if we select the objects, if we select one of these individual objects and scroll down here, we will see collisions are off. Collisions are off on these objects, and that means it's not going to collide with anything. And the collision layer is set to 0. If we select the ground floor though and set the collision layer to -1, I believe this is how we did it, now we will see that whether collisions are on or off, it will collide with everything. Okay. Now, those move around a little bit, so at this point you'll probably want to spend some time working on making those less bouncy or whatever it is you need to do to get this bouncing to look correct to you. I'm turning the bounciness all the way down the floor, and I'll turn it down on most of these pieces as well. Which, to do this at all of them at the same time, do it in the channel box. And so I can turn bounciness down to say 0.1. And now when I hit play, they're probably still going to bounce a little bit. Yeah, I'm not really happy with that. Maybe I'll go ahead and leave that up to point. I didn't really change it, did it? Okay, we'll leave it at 0.6 then. Okay, now what is actually happening here is the objects are going through the floor, and that's what's causing it to turn green. And you're just going to experience that. This is just interpenetration. You can always work with certain things to make this happen less, but the interpenetration that's happening to the floor is throwing an error, but because these objects are not colliding with each other, the interpenetration that's happening with them like how this object is inside of that object and is inside of that object, that's actually not throwing an error. It thinks that that's the normal thing to do. So we could make them collide with each other, but if we did that, Maya will crash because that's just too much calculation. So instead, we'll go ahead and hit stop. We'll go back to the first frame. And once we get this simulation, like the shatter and the gravity of everything looking the way we want it to, I think I'm actually going to put the bounciness back up on this thing. That may be part of why we're not. Yeah, see, that's looking a little better now. They just don't die quick enough. They just kind of meander around for a little too long. So we can work on that later. Okay. So after we have this simulation looking good, what we really want at that point is to bake out the animation on those. So I'm going to again open up my outliner. I'm going to select all of those pieces after I have the animation looking good again. And then we're going to basically bake the animation into keyframes. The way we do that is we go Edit, Keys, Bake Simulation. If you click your option box, you'll see that it's going to only bake selected. So I recommend you just select Translates and Rotates. It's going to sample by 1, which means it's going to set a keyframe every frame. Now, play with this. If you have a lot of minute animation, like that's hard to edit every 1 frame. So you may be able to set this to 2 or even 3, and basically it'll set a keyframe every 3 frames. If that looks good, then keep it, but for now I'm just going to use 1 because I'm going to edit this animation differently. So I can hit Bake. Basically what will happen is it will go through and set a keyframe on everything. Okay, and now you'll see that those objects I have a keyframe in the timeline for every frame all the way up to 200. Crap, I just hit the timeline and it's going to try to simulate and break. So the problem with it is right now it still has dynamics on the object. Okay, I'm also going to bake out this animation as well. So we'll go Modify, or we'll go to Edit, Keys, Bake Simulation. It actually may have done it the first time through, actually. Okay, so now there's some on this object as well. So what we need to do now is we just need to grab everything having to do with this vase and go Edit, and then Delete by Type, Rigid Bodies. And so now this is not a dynamic object anymore. It is actually just a regular object with keyframes on it. Okay, and that means we can edit these keyframes. Stuff like the objects going through the floor, we can adjust those curves. If we click this button over here, it will bring up our graph editor on top of our viewport. But really the biggest thing we want to edit is this interpenetration issues we're getting here. People will know that objects shouldn't go through each other, and if you scroll through, we're getting a lot of that in spots like this. Sorry, it's a little slow. So we're just going to try to fix that, and we could do that by editing these keyframes, but these keyframes are very dense, and that denseness is actually what gets that poppy dynamic feel that feels right. So rather than go editing around on this curve, we're actually just going to create another animation layer. So under the animation layers, this is our this is our display layers, meaning I can turn on and off visually the objects. Our render layers allow us to render differently with different layers. That's something we're not going to get into, but animation layers allows us to create multiple layers of animation that are additive. So I'm going to select all of this that we've just done here, and I'm going to, let's see, create layer from selected. Okay, now what this will do is this will actually create 2 layers. It will create the base layer, which is all that animation we just did, and then animation layer 1, which as you see has no keyframes on it anymore. I know you haven't done a lot of animation in Maya, but this will allow us to create keyframes on top of that without having to edit every